When the barbarians came, the birth of England's first knights. The 9th century was a time when the earth trembled under the weight of uncertainty. Charlemagne's empire, which had once united peoples under the promise of order and faith, began to crumble in the face of divisions, betrayals, and bloodshed. And the Roman routes, once symbols of power and civilization, became paths of despair, crisscrossed by frightened merchants and armed pilgrims. And from the north, like thunder splitting the sky, came the Vikings, the navigators of chaos. Their ships cut through the fog of the northern seas, bringing fire, steel, and fear. Entire villages disappeared beneath the echo of screams and the glow of flames. The old Roman world was dead, and a new one, wild and uncertain, was born in its place. Amidst the wreckage of this collapse, kings and feudal lords realized they were alone. Central power had fragmented, and the people cried out for protection. Walls fell, imperial armies dispersed, and each man was forced to become the guardian of his own destiny. It was in this vacuum of authority that the seed of cavalry began to germinate, not as an ideal of honor, but as an instinctive response to survival. It was the birth of a new class of warriors, not the heroes of future songs, but men forged in brutality and fear. These mounted warriors, who would later be called knights, emerged as the backbone of feudal resistance. Armed with spears, swords, and rudimentary shields, they rode across devastated fields, responding to attacks, defending villages, and protecting trade routes. They were few in number, but feared. Their strength came not only from the sword, but from loyalty. They fought not for glory, but for land, shelter, and a name to be remembered. Every sword stroke was a promise of survival, every scar a reminder that the world had become an endless battlefield. But violence wasn't the only flame that lit that time. Amidst the ruins, monks rebuilt destroyed monasteries, copied manuscripts, and rekindled the flame of knowledge. The church, once a distant symbol of the empire, began to become the spiritual heart of the new communities. And it was there, beneath the cross, that war began to transform into something more than simple defense. It became mission. Warriors began to fight not only for their masters, but for God himself. The sword and the gospel began to walk hand in hand. This fusion of faith and iron changed everything. The brutality of battle began to take on moral significance, and the mounted warrior became not only a defender of the land, but also of the sacred. Combat, once seen as a necessity, was now interpreted as a divine duty. Thus emerged the first glimpse of what, in the following centuries, would become the code of chivalry, loyalty, faith, and courage. Chaos forged a new kind of order, and from the darkness of the barbarian invasions, a light emerged, the beginning of a new era. As the northern seas continued to roar and Viking ravens flew over burning villages, the first English knights rode among ruins and hope. They did not yet wear shining armor or wield legendary swords, but they carried the fate of a continent in their hands. From the destruction of the empire, the strength of kingdoms was born. And between blood and prayer, medieval man took his first step toward eternity, mounted on his horse, guided by faith and necessity. 10th century England was a divided land, a mosaic of kingdoms balanced on the edge of the sword. The Roman heritage had vanished, and the echo of ancient civilization faded into the forests and mist-shrouded villages. Central power had been replaced by fragile alliances and oaths of survival. Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria were more than names. They were walls of resistance against a world in constant collapse. And in each of these kingdoms, men emerged determined to impose order on chaos, to erect invisible walls against the advance of the barbarians. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and reconstruction that the first bonds of feudal loyalty began to form. The figure of the warrior began to evolve. He was no longer just an isolated combatant fighting for his own survival, but a man bound by oath, a vassal who offered their loyalty in exchange for protection and land. Thus, blood and soil became currency and contract. The villages, surrounded by wooden palisades, became nuclei of political microcosms, where the lord represented the law, the judge, and the protector. And each oath of fealty was sealed not with ink, but with the touch of the sword and the promise before God. It was the beginning of the era when power was sustained by the word, and when breaking it was worse than death. These new warriors, who were beginning to master mounted combat, were trained from a young age. They learned to fight, to wield a spear, to control their horse as if it were an extension of their body. The training was rigorous, but the true learning took place in battle. On the banks of the Thames, in the hills of Kent, in the fields of Northumbria, war had become the common language of Europe. And in this language, England began to excel. Viking raids forced the kingdoms to organize, and military discipline became the new form of faith. The feudal warrior didn't fight for personal glory. He fought for the survival of his lord, his village, and his name. Each victory meant the maintenance of peace, each defeat, the risk of extinction. The battlefield was not just a stage for bloodshed, but a mirror of society. The way one fought reflected the way one lived, and little by little, the sword began to acquire spiritual significance. The idea of fighting for the good began to take root, albeit in a primitive form. The mounted warrior was no longer a mere mercenary. He was the keeper of a promise, the protector of faith, the symbol of hope in times of despair. The feudal lords, called thegns and lords, became the backbone of this new order. Around them grew not only armies, but also power structures that would give rise to the English nobility itself. The king, previously distant and symbolic, began to depend directly on these men to maintain control of the territory. The iron in their swords was the cement of the throne. The system of vassalage, seemingly simple, hid a complex web of obligations and loyalties. Each knight owed his lord not only his body but his soul, and with that, the ideal of honor and loyalty took deep roots. As the years passed, this pact between faith and sword shaped England's destiny. Barbaric chaos began to give way to structure, and structure gave shape to power. Warriors became symbols of stability, and lords became guardians of civilization. Thus, iron and prayer united under one roof, and the sound of bells began to mingle with the trotting of horses. It was the harbinger of a new age, a time when power would not be measured by strength alone, but by ability to inspire loyalty, and in which the warrior would cease to be just a soldier, to become a knight. The 11th century dawned upon an England that, though still scarred by battles and ruins, was beginning to discover the meaning of unity. Borders were no longer mere lines of defense, but territories under a common purpose. The Christian faith spread through churches and monasteries, and the echo of ancient wars began to give way to a new form of power. Power of institutionalized loyalty. It was in this setting that the Anglo-Saxon warrior began his metamorphosis into a knight. It was no longer enough to fight, it was necessary to serve. It was no longer enough to win, it was necessary to have a purpose. And so the sword became an extension of the soul, and the horse a symbol of dignity and faith. Kings like Alfred the Great and their descendants understood that the strength of a kingdom lay not only in its walls, but in the faith and discipline of its warriors. The battles against the Viking invaders taught England that iron alone could not sustain peace. Ideas were needed. From then on, the warrior fought not only for the land, but for something higher, God and the king. Thus emerged the sacred oaths, ceremonies in which the vassal knelt before his lord, and with his hand on the cross, swore eternal fidelity. These rituals, illuminated by torches and solemn words, transformed the act of war into an act of faith. Thus was born the ceremony of adubamento, the rite that marked the beginning of chivalric life. A young squire, after years of training, received the touch of a sword on his shoulder and became a knight before God and men. The metallic sound of the blade was like the seal of destiny. From that moment on, his life no longer belonged to him. To serve, to protect, to die with honor, these became the new unwritten laws of war. The battlefield became an altar, and victory an offering. War, until then a chaos of survival, now took on spiritual meaning. The castles that began to spring up throughout England were more than fortresses. They were temples of feudal power. Their towers pointed skyward like stone prayers, and their halls echoed with the sound of hymns before battle. Within them, knights learned not only to fight, but to think, to judge, to pray. The warrior's education also became moral and religious. Faith shaped the steel. The knight was the protector of the cross and the shield of divine justice. And in a world where barbarism still stalked the borders, he represented the last bastion of human hope. But beneath this aura of purity lurked a darker truth. The same man who swore to serve God was often the instrument of his own ambition. The ideal of chivalry, though born of the desire for order, carried within it the seed of contradiction. Every act of heroism was accompanied by cruelty, every victory by innocent blood. The war for faith became conflated with the war for power, and so the knight became a dual figure, a symbol of light and shadow, of redemption and destruction. Medieval England found itself before a fragmented mirror. On one side, the radiance of honor, courage, and devotion. On the other, the reflection of violence and human pride. It was this duality that would define the heart of chivalry. For being a knight was not merely wielding a sword, but carrying the weight of the world on one's shoulders. And in that fragile balance between sanctity and war, England wrote the first chapter of its true identity. A nation shaped by faith, tempered by steel, and sustained by honor. The year of 1066 would be the watershed moment in English history, a breaking point between the old world and the new. When the Norman sails appeared on the horizon, England's destiny began to change forever. The waters of the English Channel reflected the gleam of armor, and the sound of war drums heralded the beginning of a new era. At the head of the fleet, William, Duke of Normandy, looked upon the English coast not merely as an enemy, but as a conqueror sent by Providence. On the other side, the King Harold Godwinson gathered his exhausted men after fighting the Viking invaders in the north. Two armies, two worldviews, two eras about to collide, Old Saxon England and the new Norman order. A battle of Hastings, it was more than a military confrontation. It was a storm that swept away centuries of tradition. The field of Senlac Hill became the stage for the birth of a new civilization. On one side, the Saxons, arrayed with their oak shields and short spears, fervently defended the last bastion of the old order. On the other, the Normans, with heavy cavalry and refined tactics, represented the advancement of feudal discipline. When the two armies met, the ground shook under the weight of horses and lances. Arrows slashed through the air like showers of iron, and each sword stroke was a sentence. Blood mixed with the earth, the soil of an England that would never be the same. For hours the battle raged. The Saxons held out bravely, forming a living wall that seemed insurmountable. But the Normans were patient and cunning. William ordered a false retreat, luring the English into the open, and there the Norman cavalry surrounded and cut them to pieces. King Harold, shot in the eye by an arrow, fell before his men. With his death, the old Anglo-Saxon world crumbled. The silence that followed the battle was that of an empire being born. When Harold's standard was torn down, the sun of England set for the last time on an era, and a new dawn began under the Norman banner. After the victory, William was crowned king at Westminster. His dominance was not only political but also cultural and spiritual. England had become an extension of Normandy, and with it came new languages, new laws, and a new architecture of power. Stone castles, hitherto rare, began to dominate the English skyline. They were symbols of Norman authority, monuments that projected strength but also vigilance. Each stone erected was a silent reminder of who now controlled the kingdom's destiny. The Saxon nobility was replaced by Norman knights, loyal to the king and the feudal system. This transformation was brutal and profound. Lands were redistributed, former lords were deposed or executed, and the common people lived under a more rigid hierarchy than ever before. But along with oppression came structure, and with it the beginning of the English state as we know it. The feudal order brought stability, written laws, and an unprecedented centralization of power. The English knight, now molded by the Norman model, was not just a warrior. He was a cog in a system that combined throne, cross, and sword. The ideal of service to the king became sacred and loyalty, an act of faith. The Battle of Hastings was not only the birth of a new king, but the rebirth of a civilization. The fusion of the Saxon spirit, Norman discipline, and Christian faith forged the essence of medieval England. The sound of hooves that echoed across that field in 1066 would be heard for centuries, in the Crusades, in courts, in legends. From it emerged the myths that would shape the European imagination. The just king, the faithful knight, the consecrated sword. Thus, from the ashes of defeat and the blood of the fallen arose New England, daughter of war and mother of chivalry. In the years following the Norman Conquest, England was reborn under new laws, a new language, and a new political faith. But the transition was not peaceful. The Saxon people, now submissive to foreign masters, saw their lands taken and their customs erased. Norman rule imposed itself with the weight of the sword and the coldness of strategy. Fortresses rose like stone teeth on hills and valleys, symbols of the new power that watched over the people and silenced rebellions. Yet within these fortresses, something deeper was being forged, a chivalric culture that would transform the warrior into a symbol of order, faith, and discipline. The knight was no longer merely the lord's arm, but the visible face of authority. These castles became the beating heart of medieval power. Their gates were not merely barriers, but portals between two worlds, the brutality of war and the promise of civilization. Inside, in the great torchlit halls, young squires learned the craft of the sword and the duty of loyalty. From an early age, they trained not only to fight, but to obey, to serve, to embody the ideal of the Christian warrior. The physical training was grueling, but the morale was even more severe. Being a knight meant taming not only the body, but also the spirit, overcoming fear, anger, and doubt. It was an education for obedience, but also for glory. Over time, the figure of the knight became inseparable from faith. The church, realizing the symbolic power of this new class of warriors, began to shape their image. Sermons spoke of just war, of fighting in the name of God. Steel, until then a symbol of destruction, came to be seen as an instrument of redemption. Swords were blessed, crosses were engraved on shields, and sacred oaths were sworn before battle. Each knight was, in essence, an armed missionary, the defender of Christianity. This alliance between the altar and the throne made chivalry not just a profession, but a path to salvation. But with the sanctification of war, also came the temptation of power. Many feudal lords transformed their spiritual authority into absolute dominion. Lands and armies grew, and the king had to balance a dangerous game between the loyalty of his vassals and the threat of his ambition. England, though unified, became a field of constant tension, an unstable balance held together by promises and steel. Local revolts and feuds between nobles were common, and in each echoed the eternal question: who truly ruled, the king or the sword? Even so, the feudal order endured because it was built on deep beliefs. Each man knew his place in the world, and this sense of hierarchy was the foundation of medieval stability. The peasant tilled the land believing that service was a duty before God. The lord believed that ruling was a divine right, and the knight, at the center of this pyramid, was the guardian of divine will on earth. He fought, judged, and protected. His life was brief, but his legacy was eternal. He was the perfect figure for an age that saw glory as the antidote to fear, and faith as the justification for violence. Thus, from the blood spilled in the conquest, a new society was born. The echoes of ancient invasions faded beneath the sound of bells and the trotting of horses. England had become the mirror of Europe, a land of deep faith, of powerful lords, and of knights who believed they served something greater than themselves. Iron and prayer merged into a single symbol, the armored knight, guardian of a kingdom seeking light amidst darkness. The Middle Ages, with all its contradictions, had found its protagonist. The 12th century brought with it the consolidation of chivalry, and with it the height of feudal England. The lands were already divided, the castles erected, and the power structure established. The king reigned by the grace of God, and the knights became the backbone of his domain. They were the shield and sword of the throne, but also the symbol of a faith that now mingled with war. The cross was no longer merely a sign of devotion, it had become a battle banner. England, strengthened under the reign of the Normans, began to look beyond its borders. The call to the Crusades echoed through the monastery halls and village squares. The Christian world marched eastward, and the English knights would respond with fervor. The Crusades were not just holy wars, they reflected the contradictory soul of the Middle Ages. Men sworn to protect the innocent wielded swords that took lives in the name of God. Each journey to the Holy Land was a mixture of penance and ambition. For many, it was a chance for redemption. For others, an opportunity for glory and riches. When the English knights marched under banners marked with the Red Cross, they believed they were liberating Jerusalem. But in the sands of the East, they discovered that faith could also taste bitterly of doubt. The heat, hunger, and bloodshed made the sacred pilgrimage a journey of shadows and regrets. War shaped the characters of these men, but also corroded them. Those who returned to England brought not only medals and stories, but memories of horrors and profound questions. What did it mean to fight in the name of God? How many innocent souls could be sacrificed in the name of faith? The answers were lost amid the tolling of church bells and the clanging of swords. England welcomed back different knights, not only more experienced, but darker. They had seen the heart of the world and discovered that hell sometimes wore the cloak of holiness. Meanwhile, on English soil, the feudal system reached its peak of tension. The people bore the burden of taxes and wars, and feudal lords, enriched by the Crusades, became almost as powerful as the king. Alliances were fragile, sustained by oaths and the need for balance. And within the castle walls, a new kind of unrest grew: doubt. Monks and chroniclers began to question whether chivalry, born to defend, had become an instrument of oppression. The faith that once united was beginning to divide. Yet even amid moral decay, the image of the knight endured. Literature and troubadours transformed him into a myth, a hero of unshakable virtues. Songs spoke of courage, loyalty, and courtly love, erasing the blood that stained their swords. The knight became the ideal of medieval man, noble, devout, and invincible. In the courts, the word honor became more powerful than the blade itself. Reality and legend blended until no one knew where man ended and myth began. Thus, England witnessed the birth of the archetype that would span the centuries: the knight in shining armor, a symbol of faith and bravery, but also a silent witness to human contradictions. He represented the height and limit of the Middle Ages, a man divided between heaven and earth, between sin and redemption. Even encased in iron, he was vulnerable to doubt. Even guided by faith, he was surrounded by violence, and with the distant sound of abbey bells and the clopping of horses' hooves in the mud, medieval England became the stage for the eternal battle between the spirit and the sword, a battle that would echo until the end of time.